Welcome everyone to the Week 2 presentation for ME121, Human Anatomy and Physiology. Let's dive right in and see what we're focusing on this week. This week we have 2 chapters to focus on, so definitely make sure in your textbook you read through both chapters in its entirety, even though our presentation will only focus on the bits and pieces to help you prepare for the quiz. It doesn't mean the rest of the information is not important, and the rest of the information in those chapters will also help you with your discussion and assignments as well. So it is important to read all of the information. Chapter 3 focuses on the integumentary system, just a really fancy way to say hair, skin, and nails, basically. And Chapter 13 focuses on the immune system. We're going to look first at the integumentary system, and specifically we're going to talk about the skin. The skin is the body's tough outer protective covering, and it has many important functions. Let's go through some of those functions together. One thing the skin does is it's responsible for maintaining homeostasis, and that's that even, calm state that we talked about last week in week 1. The skin also functions to regulate temperature. It helps protect the underlying tissues. It helps prevent water loss, so the skin prevents the loss of fluids so the cells do not dry out, and that's important to know. The skin houses sensory receptors. It synthesizes certain biochemicals. It can excrete wastes, and it is part of the process to make vitamin D. The skin contains a compound that is converted to vitamin D when the skin is exposed to ultraviolet rays from the sun, and that's also important to remember for your quiz. There are various layers to our skin, and you can see them on our slide here. 3 in particular that we're going to focus on: the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous. Let's start with those. The outer covering is the epidermis, and it's made of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Important to know for sure. The dermis is considered the inner layer of the skin. It has connective tissue, blood vessels, and nervous tissue. The blood vessels and nerves are generally absent in the epidermis, but they are found throughout the dermis. That's an important distinction to remember. The subcutaneous layer, that's beneath the dermis, and it's also known as the superficial fascia. It insulates to conserve body heat, and it impedes the entrance of external heat. It contains major blood vessels as well. So let's talk about a few more things. The pattern of ridges and grooves that are visible on our skin of our soles and the palms, that reflects the arrangement of the dermal elevations beneath. And you can see those dermal elevations in this cross section of our skin here. The distribution of fat in the subcutaneous layer, and that is represented by the yellow that we see in our cross section, is largely responsible for the characteristic male versus female body shapes. Next, we're going to touch on skin color. So, melanocytes, which lie deep within the epidermis and the underlying dermis, they produce a pigment called melanin, and that protects deeper cells from the sun's ultraviolet rays and gives color to the skin. So skin color results from a combination of genetic, environmental, and physiologic factors. All people have about the same number of melanocytes. Genetic differences in skin color results from differing amounts of melanin, along with the size and distribution of the melanin granules. Exposure to sunlight, UV light from sun lamps, and X-rays can cause darkening of the skin as melanin production increases. Circulation within dermal blood vessels affects skin color as well. Well-oxygenated blood gives a pinkish color. Poorly oxygenated blood gives a cyanosis, which is a bluing of the skin. Yellowish skin color can result from eating too many foods with carotene or from cyanosis due to liver disease. So our skin color and whether it changes over time is important to note in terms of our health. Next, Next, we're going to talk about hair. So here we see a cross-section of a hair follicle. So each hair develops from an epithelial stem cell at the base of a tube-like depression called the hair follicle. The dermis contains the hair root. The part of the hair above the skin surface is known as the shaft. That's important to know. As new cells are formed, old cells are pushed outward and become keratinized and die, forming the hair shaft. Keratin is a tough waterproofing protein which fills most of the epidermal cells. Let's look at one particular skin gland that your quiz focuses on, and that's the sebaceous gland. The sebaceous gland is also known as the oil gland, and they are associated with hair follicles, and they secrete sebum. That sebum oils the hair, it lubricates the surface of the skin, and it helps prevent water loss. So it is pretty darn important. Moving next, there's one thing I want you to remember about your nails. And again, our nails, when we're talking about it, can be our fingernails or our toenails. Obviously pictured here are just fingernails, but let's not leave out the toenails. The nails consist mainly of compressed keratin, and that's one fact that I know your quiz wants you to know as well. Moving on next to our immune system. So the immune system uses a complex system of chemical signaling between specialized cells to identify, attack, and remember antigens. Immunology is the study of the body's defense mechanisms, or the study of the immune system. In an immune response, the body will recognize foreign molecules and responds to eliminate them. Immunity depends on the body's ability to distinguish between self and non-self. Non-self would be pathogens. Innate immune responses are rapid responses directed against foreign agents in general. Immune responses depend on communication among cells or cell signaling. Next, let's look at innate immune responses in more detail. So, barriers to pathogen entry include the skin, the mucus lining of the respiratory pathways, and also acid secretions in the stomach. Cytokines are signaling molecules in both innate and adaptive immune responses. Interferons, and I want you to remember interferons, they are cytokines produced by cells infected by viruses. They signal other cells to reproduce antiviral proteins. Some complement proteins stimulate phagocytosis and inflammation. Phagocytes, these include our neutrophils and our macrophages. They ingest bacteria and other foreign matter by phagocytosis. And we touched on phagocytes last week when we talked about our cellular makeup. Phagocytosis is a cell where a cell flows around a bacterium and engulfs it. Another cell I want you to remember is NK cells, also called natural killer cells. They destroy cancer cells and also cells infected with viruses and other pathogens. The clinical characteristics of inflammation are heat, redness, edema, also known as swelling, and pain. Phagocytes move into the infected areas, increasing phagocytosis. Fever is a clinical sign of widespread infection, and that's important to remember. Allergic reaction is an example of the immune system overreacting to mild antigens. In allergic reactions, mast cells, that's M-A-S-T, cells, they release histamine, which leads to inflammation. Next, let's talk about adaptive immune responses. And that's over on the right side in the violet purple color. Adaptive immune responses are directed against particular pathogens. In adaptive immune responses, the body produces antibodies that recognize and bind to specific antigens. And an antigen is basically a large molecule that can be recognized as foreign. Adaptive immune responses include cell-mediated immunity and antibody-mediated immunity. In cell-mediated immunity, specific T cells are activated when they come in contact with specific antigens. Those activated T cells multiply and give rise to clones of identical cells. That part is important to remember, that activated T cells multiply and give rise to clones of identical cells. Let's talk about active versus passive immunity, or natural versus acquired. So active immunity, whether natural or by immunization, involves exposure to an antigen and an active immune response. Memory cells are produced, and that helps provide long-term protection because those memory cells will remember that. In passive immunity, antibodies are borrowed from another person or animal that has produced them. Passive immunity is temporary. So active immunity develops from exposure to antigens. And again, an antigen is a molecule recognized as foreign by the cells of the immune system. Pregnant women, they actually confer passive immunity upon their developing babies by producing antibodies for them. Next, we see antibody-mediated immunity. Let's look at this, and I know the graphic is really small. It does come from your textbook, so you can always locate it within the chapter to see it in a larger version. But what I want you to remember are the words that are on here. Antibodies are transported by the circulatory system to the site of infection. Their main job is to identify that antigen as foreign. Then antibodies combine with the specific antigens and form the antigen-antibody complex. So they combine and attach themselves. This may inactivate the pathogen. It stimulates phagocytes and activates the complement system. So basically that's how we develop that immunity. Moving on, let's just talk more specifically about certain cells of the immune response. There's a lot of key players here. B cells, which are responsible for the antibody-mediated immunity that we just talked about, they mature into plasma cells that produce specific antibodies. And I want you to remember that plasma cells produce specific immune antibodies. Some T cells differentiate to become killer T cells that migrate to the site of infection and kill pathogens. Helper T cells, they secrete cytokines that activate B cells and promote immune responses. And some activated T cells remain in the lymph nodes and are known as memory T cells. Memory T cells remain in the lymph tissue for many years after an infection. That's important to remember for your quiz. Now that we've hit the highlights of this week's material, definitely let me know if you have further questions, need additional help. At this point, with week 1 behind us, hopefully the expectation's a little more clear. You should know that more of the ins and outs of how to use the classroom. If you are still struggling with any of that, please reach out to me. As always, our information for this week did come from our textbook. Definitely read through that. That is your resource for our class. Thank you so much for your time this week, and have a great week.